Okay, thank you so much. I just wanted to make sure before we started.
Yeah, it's the professional thing to do.
Yes.
All right.
Um, Aloe, would you like to begin, like sort of um how you like found do you prefer Dr. Bronsky or Michael? I think that's our first question.
Oh, well, I don't have a doctorate, so Michael is fine.
Oh, okay.
Okay, perfect.
Perfect.
Well,
Professor Bronsky, Michael.
no one calls me, hardly anybody even says professor in the office, so it's fine. Michael is fine.
Okay. Well then, Aloe, would you like to maybe let Michael know like sort of our background and how you discovered his book in the first place and clued us all in since you started this journey out for us?
Yeah, so we had a meeting with our professor just to like check in on how we were doing with our project, basically going over our proposal, what we had so far. And so we got to talking, and she said something about finding a like textbook or a book and trying to make contact with an author.
Mhm.
So that set my brain running. So I looked up like book lists, and your book came up on the list, and I saw the title and I was like, that would be a perfect title. Like it sounds like a perfect book for our project. So I looked you up and I just noticed that you were a professor, and I was like, if anyone's going to respond, it's going to be a professor.
I wouldn't count on
So
it. I have plenty of colleagues who do not respond, but
yeah, well, we were like, okay, if the choice is between like someone who's like just an author or someone who's an author and a professor, the professor is more likely to respond. So that was why we went with your book, and the title was perfect. And we happened to have a copy at our university library, so I checked it out that day. Um, and then, yeah, so
great.
that's how we found you.
Great. And you have there are two versions, right? There's the first version, and then there's the one for young adults.
Yes.
Yeah, we have the young adult version.
The young adult version, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we can begin just with a few of our questions then. So maybe we can start with just what was the process like of starting this book and what made you decide to write it in the first
Well,
place?
it's I have a very sad answer to that. It wasn't my idea to write it, it was my editor's. um the I mean, it's true that I've been doing this work since 1969, so it wasn't like she picked somebody out of the blue. I'd had written extensively on these topics. Right, writing the original book, the first one that came, the young queer history of the U.S. It was interesting. It took me a while, maybe a year, to really figure out what I was doing, because I didn't want to write a book that just had famous queer people with famous names in it.
Mhm.
Right. I really wanted to write something about history that was actually about US history, and really make it queer, right? Really make it um really show not just like, oh, there's American history, and guess what? George Washington was gay, or Gertrude Stein was gay, or Maria Quee was a lesbian. So it really took me a while to think about how can I think about it here? There's an old saying in sort of early women's studies, right, that in fact women's history is much more than add one woman and stir, right? And I didn't want to actually add one homosexual and stir, right? So it really made me rethink what it meant to be queer from the inside out. But so this goes for the young adult book, it has a different process, but it basically was the same material.
Mhm.
Right. So I really tried to think about, what would it mean for same-sex loving people in the 1890s to be involved in American culture, right? They may leave their homes and may move to the city, because you could have more sex in the city than you could in a farm town in Iowa. Um, and then that really clued me into notions about looking at like population migrations across the country, right? What does it mean that Emma Goldman, right, was actually speaking out, defending homosexuals, particularly Oscar Wilde, in 1900, and how did that connect with her anarchism? How did that connect with her radical politics? Right? What did it mean that, I mean, I can't even think of all their names. All those women in the early public health movement were either lesbians, or they were single women, or they didn't get married, or they were women who were married but who lived very autonomous lives, right? So it didn't matter that if so and so had a female partner. What mattered was that what mattered was what their choices were, and how did that contribute to the larger tapestry of American history. Yeah, I mean, one example was, what did it mean that so many male bodies were, I mean, like in today's terms, 6 million were destroyed during the Civil War, and what did that do for the public perception of the male body? I mean, clearly, all those soldiers who died were not gay, obviously, although Walt Whitman, who wrote about them, was, right? So what did that do to like American literature, right? What does it mean that many of the great women artists after the Civil War were all lesbian artists who actually created big, large statues of patriotic men? Yeah. So the process was really trying to think it through from the inside out, rather than just apply famous names to situations.
Yeah.
So when I actually, so stop me at any point, because I can talk for 4 hours without stopping in the classroom. So when I got to the young adult version, it was a totally different thing, because the Richies, whose name is on the book cover, didn't actually do any writing. It's all written by me, but according to sort of annoyed me actually, but according to industry standards, the editorial advisor, which he was, since he's written other books for young people, gets his name on the cover. And in that case, I had to relearn how to write, because I needed, like each little story had to be 1,600 words, and you had to tell a story, right? So it couldn't be history. It had to be like, when Charlotte Cushman was a 7-year-old, she went to the church run by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then later discovered that she wanted to be an actress. So it had to be done in very sort of colloquial terms that, and it was unclear who young people were, anywhere from like, maybe 10 or 11 to maybe 15, which is, as you know, a really, think for yourself as 10, and then at 15, it's like a century.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like actually 13 to 15 is a century. 10 to 15 is like four centuries. So it was really hitting a balance of how much information to put in a way that was easily accessible through storytelling, and like making it personal. I mean, luckily all these people are completely fascinating, right? So I was like, telling the stories was actually easy, because they all had great lives. The other, which since you're working on this project, you may find interesting, is that the marketing people, because it's called the publishing industry. So they actually want to make money from the books. Right. So the marketing people at Random House, who's the distributor for Beacon Press, said, according to their surveys, I couldn't mention anything sexual in the first 35 or 40 pages, because that's all people look at when they buy the book in schools.
Oh.
So like I had to change, Stonewall was not a bar, it was a club. Right. In one of the first chapters, I say that I wanted to go to early GLF meetings to find somebody to go home with. Which actually meant to fuck with, but but they actually that was implicit, I thought, but that they said I had to change it to make friends with. I like make friends with, right? But after the first 40 pages that I could say anything. So by the time you get to the Carl Whitman stuff, he's a 16-year-old teenager having sex with married men in bathrooms in Teaneck, New Jersey. So, I mean, publishing is sort of complicated, because you you want to write the book you want to write, which I did, and I actually like the book. You want to write a book that you're proud of. You want to write a book that's going to sell. You want to write a book that's not going to get you into trouble, which a little bit late for that given Florida, right? But you have to balance all of these things. So anyway, I've talked too much. You must have other questions.
No, that was a lot of good information, especially about the publishing. I think so that is a common practice in terms of textbook publishers as well with the
Oh, I think so, yeah. Even more with textbook publishers, right? Because what the process and you probably know this, the process, textbooks are actually sold throughout the country, so every state has their own standards.
Yeah.
So what you have is that you actually have the fact that the lowest possible standard is the one that wins out. Like Texas is going to win out over Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Or over Rhode Island, right? Because in Rhode Island, or say that like in Massachusetts, which actually has actively ongoing programs to introduce, or California, introduce queer studies, queer histories into schools, textbooks, they will literally lose sales in Texas if they don't follow the Texas standards. My book is less a textbook, and interestingly, we actually never viewed it as a textbook, right? Because that's a whole different set of companies, a whole different set of like marketing too. The joke at Beacon was that the queer history for young people was going to do extremely well for queer aunts and uncles to give to nieces and nephews.
I love that. Oh my gosh, I love that.
Yeah.
So the young people's version, then, like, what, someone just approached you and asked you to adapt it to that, or?
Yeah, well, my book, so Beacon Press years ago, like in 2010 or so, Guy Tree, who's my editor, right, wanted to do a series called Revisioning America, I think it's called. And she began to sign people up. I was the first person to be signed up and the first one to actually finish it. The first time I ever finished anything on time, or not on time, before other people did. And then they had the idea that they would actually start a YA series of it. So several of the books. So if you look, there's a great book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz about an indigenous people's history of the US, that she said, turn it into a YA book. I have no interest in doing it particularly, but I will look at whatever they write and make corrections.
Yeah.
I'm too much of a control queen to actually give up. I mean, I felt that I had to write it on my own. So it wasn't, again, it was a plan for the publishing company, and I think a great plan. I mean, I think it's done very well. I think it's really important to people. I have to get emails from people from like out of the blue saying, this book was terrific, or I got an email from the mother of one of the, it was odd, an email from the mother of one of the queer athletes who appears at the end of the book, telling me I had gotten things wrong about his story.
Oh
my gosh.
Well, not really wrong, but she said, why didn't you mention this? I thought, oh, give me a break, lady. It's like 1,300 words. I know it's your son, but it's like.
Wow.
And she did find a small factual mistake. So that was, I mean, like really small factual mistake was corrected.
I guess like tangentially off of that,
Yeah.
like just the process of writing the book and things like that. With your experience of writing this book and getting all the information, was there anything in particular that like either like surprised you that you found, or that you connected with, or just during this process, anything that was kind of like shocking to you whenever you were putting it all together, or anything like that? Just anything, I guess, that stuck out to you, I guess?
No, that's a great question. I think, I kept on, so I've been doing this, as I said, for, I can't even count, 50 years, more than 50 years. Right. And I've read most of the histories that have come out. I actually have written about this material. I was shocked that I was always finding new stuff I had not seen before.
Yeah.
Like I had and that other people really hadn't really explored at all, right? Like there's this woman named Maria Cui, I think she's in the YA book, right? Who actually does all this. She's a doctor out in Oregon. She goes to jail for she's a war resistor. Well, it turns out she had an affair with Margaret Sanger. That was very quiet, that people didn't talk about much, right? And she also had an affair with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was a major radical communist labor organizer. And, you know, and in the case of Flynn, right, that it's all in the archives, but the Communist Party, which she stayed with for her whole life, never let it be published. So there was lots of stuff that I found, you know. I mean, I have to say also, right, that I do not tell this to my students. A great deal of the book I began writing about looking on Wikipedia. I double checked all the sources and I read the original text as well. But there's nothing wrong with beginning with Wikipedia. Just don't end there, right? But you know, people would say to me, I would do events. They say, "How did you find those letters from the Marquis de Lafayette to George Washington?" You know, the answer is that they're on Google. You can do, you know, the entire works of the Marquis de Lafayette are on the internet. You have to sort of go through them, but you know, you can. I mean, I think it took me half an hour to figure out the right dates because the Marquis de Lafayette wrote a lot of letters. But you know, I didn't know, so I'm not really a trained historian. You know, I went to college. I went to an inner city commuter working class college in Newark, New Jersey in the 60s, right? And then I got an MFA in playwriting. Right. And my joke is that I discovered that there was more money to be made in gay political organizing than in playwriting, which I think is actually true in my case. So I'm not trained to do archival work, although I've actually done it, right? So everything in the book is really, for the most part, from secondary sources. You know, so but even using those, I mean, I didn't have those moments people say that they actually find the lost letter from somebody to somebody else, right? So I was surprised at things I found, but what really surprised me was how, even though I knew all this, how moving I found some of it. Like it struck me as like, you know, once I was pulling it together, this is stuff that I never imagined would pull together in the way that it did. And I thought, oh my God, this is really American history. You know, and in the first book, right, I say that America's many things. It's wonderful, it's horrible, it's scary, it's destructive. You know, in some way, it's really queer. In that, not queer, not in the sexual sense, but queer in the sense that you're pulling together all these things that don't match up together. And it made me rethink how complicated the country really is. Right, as somebody who's been doing political work since I was like 15, like going on civil rights marches. So 15, I'm talking about 1964, 65, right? And I've pretty much always sort of hated the country. It actually made, in some weird way, it made me think about the country again. I mean, I still sort of hate it, right? But it made me rethink about my complicated feelings, and to see the real diversity is not quite the right word, but the real complexity of what the American project, as people call it in history, that what the American project has actually been. And also, right, really made me sort of sad, right, that most people don't ever see that because they're taught one kind of history, usually pretty stupid.
Yeah, I definitely think that's what I found at like the heart of your book is the complexity. And now all four of us, we are all studying to teach in the middle childhood. So, you know, we are going to be licensed between 4th and 9th grade, which is, you know, when we get those textbooks being like very shallow, not exactly, you know, doesn't really dig into the complexity that your book mentions. How do you think that we as teachers or even textbook publishers or those designing the curriculum can sort of put more complexity into those lessons when we're dealing with students that may be coming from a really shallow background in terms of what they know about U.S. history and who's mentioned and who's not mentioned.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that, and I've actually done a bunch of consulting now over the last few years with people who are designing curriculum. So I've thought about this a bit, right? Is because I was at a conference a few years ago, and in California, these teachers said, we really want to teach this. We really want to do it, but we know nothing about it. We don't know how to go about it. We don't know any of the material. What do we do? And I kind of think that going back to how the second book worked, right, is that history is stories, right? And if you're dealing with, I'm not sure about fourth grade, if you're dealing with like seventh grade, right, and you can find stories to get them interested, that's the way to approach the complexity. Also, I do think using primary source documents, when they're really easily available, right, is a great way to get people to like look at a letter or a diary or a communication and see what they think about it. And that's true in the college level. I mean, I just had in my class at school, right, their last assignment, which I was just reading through, they went to Schlesinger Library, which is a women's history library at Radcliffe, and they had 5 people to choose from, but they had to go into the archives and find 3 artifacts, diaries, letters, or whatever, and just compare them and create and argue why they were important to understanding this moment in this person's history. Right. But I think that so I've done this in class as well, right? I usually teach a queer history thing up at Dartmouth. Queer history thing, a queer history class, a class called Gay and Lesbian History. Right. And we sort of looked at the George Washington Lafayette letters that are in the book. And I said, what do you think about this? And student, and actually I must say that my favorite, they're all from Lafayette, wondering why George hasn't returned his letters. Right. It's sort of sad, really, because it looks like he's been dumped. Right. And this woman in class said, well, I don't know how to read them. I don't know how to read 18th century rhetoric. I don't know the emotional content. She said, but I can see from this that the Marquis de Lafayette is such a girl. I just want to say, like, please, he's not going to text you back. Stop it. You're really getting yourself. Right, which I thought was like the most brilliant, wonderful, insightful response. Because obviously she had been in that situation herself. Right.
Yeah.
Also, right, she understood to the core of what those letters were.
And it's just really interesting to see like those modern applications and like drawing those connections. It's always really interesting to see how those get pulled together when they're presented with this information.
Yeah, and also people, I mean, the reality is that people's lives change. Your life is nothing like my life was when I was 20 or whatever, but the emotions are probably very similar. Right, the Marquis de Lafayette was being dumped by George Washington in like some profound way. And that's a real insight, right, into the continuity of, so what I guess what I'm sort of getting around to in a roundabout sloppy way is that what makes the books work, both of them, is that it really focuses on the emotional content. And I think when you're doing curriculum, that actually getting students to think about, if they're in 7th or 8th or 9th grade, right, maybe harder in 4th and 5th grade, what the emotional content is that they can relate to and how that relates to their lives and what they did. Also, what I didn't know, I knew it in the second book. I'm not sure it's not in the first, maybe it's not in the second. I did not realize that the Marquis de Lafayette named his first son after George Washington. and also when he was buried, had ground brought over from Mount Vernon to put on his coffin,
Wow.
which is both wonderful and creepy.
Yeah. Oh my
Makes the
gosh.
letters even sadder.
My gosh. I think you brought up a really interesting point about like the emotional connections because I'm student teaching right now, and one of the things that the history department at the school I'm at talks about all the time is like how can we get the kids to connect the history to the fact that like this is real people. It's not just like made up stories that we're telling them. And I just thought that was such an interesting point because like I think if we had more of these like personal stories that we could share with students, it would really help them to see like, okay, this isn't just some like made up guy named George Washington who
Right.
like did something cool. It was like, okay, this is like a real man who had real emotions, real feelings, and there were real consequences, you know, to the things that happened in his life. So
I mean, I think the other thing I have a book on my desk here somewhere, a pile. So there's a book, no need to read it. It's called The Dialectic of Sex by Philemon Firestone. It's a Marxist Freudian analysis of second wave of radical feminism. But she makes this great point, which she comes actually from Marx and Engels, which is that history is not it's the way she phrases it, that history is not a snapshot, it's a movie.
Yeah.
So which makes, of course, makes perfect sense, right? But that you just can't have like George Washington snapshot, right? It's
yeah.
but a cherry tree or whatever you want to have, right? Or even if you take Thomas Jefferson, right? He's like Declaration of Independence, slave, sort of had, his mistress was Sally Hemings, enslaved people worked on his planet. Each of those are snapshots, but to put them all together and to really get a student to think about what does it mean to say all men are created equal, and then to have enslaved people, and then to actually have relationships with enslaved people, some of whose children become slaves. I mean, I'm sure Thomas Jefferson was a really smart, complicated person. And we can hate him for things and we can point out the good things he did, but to get to the emotion of that is really beyond the 4th and 5th grade level. But possibly, I bet you get really good responses from 8th and 9th graders.
Yeah.
Because it is a movie, right? It's not just the snapshot. It is in fact the entire the entire unraveling of history, as well as the progression of history. Or should I say, it's the progression of history as it unravels. Is that helpful for?
Yeah, no, definitely.
No, this is all really helpful.
This is great. And I guess to sort of bring it around to another question, but sort of relate to one of the things you just mentioned, and sort of your process with writing this book. It's like you mentioned, you see all these stories, they're really emotional and you connect to them, and they are important stories. They give you a greater view of history. But for all of us, and I think this is something we can agree on, myself included, we still to this day, like all the stuff I know about this, whether it be from reading your book or just looking at it online, this is stuff I had to teach myself.
Yeah.
And it's not anything you see in schools at all. And that's kind of the focus of our project, is like bringing that to light. Why isn't this in schools? Why don't we bring up these identities, things like that? So, and I know there's a lot of obvious answers to this question, but in your opinion, why is it that we still see such a lack of this in curriculum and in schools? And just from a perspective of someone who wrote about this, I guess, what is your thoughts on that?
I think, again, right, that's really complicated, because in fact,
it is.
What I was taught in the 50s and 60s was so much worse than what you were taught 10 years ago. There has been progression. I grew up in New Jersey. I went to Catholic schools, right? So we actually had which had Catholic textbooks, right? I'm going to put when the light goes out, I look like I'm in a Martin Scorsese movie as it gets darker and darker. And I'm like Robert De Niro being corrupted by the mafia. But that looks better. Right, that we had history books in high school, right, that actually argued that the Inquisition was not a bad thing.
Mhm.
Spanish Inquisition, right? So things have gotten better, not quickly enough, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's actually articles right about textbooks even up until the 50s arguing that there were many aspects of slavery that were helpful for enslaved people.
Yeah.
Right, which you can only now say in Florida.
Just about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, things go back and forth, right? So, you know, one book I would, and I used it as a sort of inspiration, not as a model. There's a book called People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn,
Mhm.
which may have looked at which is actually, I think that Howard's approach is really, really good. Which is that you really write history from the outside in rather than from the, is that the right metaphor? Yeah, from the outside in rather than from the top down.
Mhm.
Right, because there are people who are saying, well, if you want to do a really correct history, you write it from the grassroots up, right? From the view of the oppressed people, not the people from the top down. And I think what Howard does in the book, right, is that he actually doesn't, that's what happens, but he's really writing it from the outside going in rather than the inside looking at the outside.
Mhm.
So is that sort of the approach you took when writing your book then? Did you take it
It was.
outside?
I took it something a little bit different, which is rather than, because most of my writing has been about culture, right? I was a film critic, a movie theater critic, a book critic. I wrote cultural commentary. I wrote lots of articles about popular culture, right? As well as politics. So if there's one thing that guided me in my writing, which is, and I think it's very true, like ask myself, why did this movie happen at this time? What in the culture allowed this movie? So think of a movie from 5 years ago. Well, think of Black Panther, right? Why did Black Panther, because the comic book goes back to the 40s, I think, or the 50s. the like character, right? Why did Black Panther only get made when it did? And I think that there's a whole set of reasons why that happened, right? But it's sort of exploring why things happen when they happen in that, to use Firestone analogy, in that, not snapshot, but movie. Why is this happening at this moment in the movie? Right. So, one thing I looked at in, I don't think it's in the YA book, but how did technology change life for gay people? Changing technologies, right? What did it mean that and one example I use in the original book, right, is that the invention of the car created a space of privacy for people that they never had before. So they could have sex in the car, they could talk quietly in the car, they could take the car out of their family's home and go to a different place.
Mhm.
Would never happened before. Because a horse and buggy was actually a little bit, you couldn't really have sex in a horse and buggy. Well, I'm sure people did, but you really can do it in the same way you could in a car. Right, but when you think about, the role of technology, not at all queer, not at all gay at all, right? So I was focused on looking at these large moments in American history where, in fact, things happened, right? Movies happened. What did it mean? What was the effect of this shift in representation
Mhm.
that film allowed, or what did it mean that actually, the sort of amazing advent, even though it's all horrible, of like television,
Mhm.
where in fact literally they brought the entire world into the privacy of your own private home. And what did that mean for people, right? And if you look at TV, what did it mean that people like Liberace, who everybody suspected or knew was gay, was literally in your living room. So I tried to follow Howard's outside in approach, but also to locate things in the realm of cultural change.
Mhm.
With that being said, with following the history and cultural change, in this moment in history where we are right now, because history is continuous. It's a movie, like you said.
It's a
In
movie.
2023,
It's actually
how
a
do you
horror
see-
movie at the moment.
Yeah.
It's between Scream and Scary
Oh.
Movie.
Yes.
Well, that's sort of like is my question. Do you think that we've hit like a critical year, a critical time in which the pendulum may be swinging backwards in terms of political landscapes and what we're seeing in Florida and Texas and some more of the conservative states? Or do you see the pendulum maybe moving forward in terms of this is just a momentary setback? It's going to continue, representation is going to be continuing in the next few years in terms of being more widespread and widely accepted by more people.
Yeah, I think that I use a drug metaphor. I think the pendulum is on crystal meth and it's all over the place. Right. It's like, I do think, not to plagiarize Martin Luther King, right, but I do think you're always that whatever the line is, right, that the arc of justice is always going, or the arc is always going towards justice and freedom. And I think we've seen that, since the Enlightenment. But so a good example, the Enlightenment, a great idea. It got rid of religion, it brought in science. Right. It also brought in the French Revolution, right, that it did amazing things. And went a little bit too far as the French Revolution, although I always point out in class, whatever happened after the French Revolution, called the Terror, was probably not as bad as what the king was doing to peasants before the revolution. So don't blame the revolutionaries for bad things, right? It's a movie, right? It started out with the king being, and the Enlightenment got rid of the divine right of kings, right? I think that what we'll be seeing is in America, but globally, right, and it's clear, but we're seeing a rise in right-wing thinking, whether it be dictatorships or whether it be in Turkey or in Hungary or Trump here, right? In other places, in some aspects of the Israeli government, although Israel is so fractured, there are people on the other side fighting back against that. I think we're seeing something that's not unprecedented with conservatism, but something that we've seen, we saw it before in the late 70s with Anita Bryant, and with the real cultural and the rise of the moral majority and the rise of the Christian evangelical right. They were still going through today a little bit, but that things have gotten much better. So I think it does go back and forth, but I think that actually overall we're moving to a better place, even with lots of setbacks. I think it's also important to actually, when you're looking at history, right, is to always, particularly talking to students, is right. So there's a great quote from James Baldwin, which I use in class constantly. I don't have it at hand here, where he says that there's a myth that history is something that happened in the past, but in fact, history is always with us. History it's from. I can send it to you later. I have it written out in my lecture notes, right? But in fact, history is not in the past. History is today, and everything that happened in the past is still happening now. That we really carry the residue, the resonance of what happened in the past with us. And it's not that we just move on from it. In fact, it's always there. As opposed to saying, well, things are certainly better now, or things are worse now, which is, both are true, but in fact, it's not like whatever happened back then isn't affecting us in the moment. as well.
This is not really this is not a question, but it's more of a comment. But I just want to say that like this book was just so awesome to read.
Thank
I
you.
thought like thank you. As a queer person myself, like it's so crazy how much like I thought I was like well informed, and then I read this book and I was like, I know nothing, right? Like I know nothing.
That's how I felt writing it.
Yeah. And it's so crazy because it's like I feel like in the 21st century we have a habit of, and maybe not we as, but more of like, especially like right-wing people have a habit of thinking that like queer people have just now emerged, like this is like a new thing. And it's like reading something like this and you know seeing that you know there's evidence and there's proof that we have always existed, we have been in every facet of every part of life. And it's just like I don't know, I think it's so critical like to have that kind of information and to be able to get that representation.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I think it's also true that right, that we have to understand the complexity of that, right? So that if we look at particularly around language and identity, right? So can we say that Michelangelo was gay? No, because the word didn't exist and he's not how he understood himself.
Yeah.
Right. If he understood himself as anything, it was probably as a sodomite, which was the theological term used at the time. You know, so that I think you're totally correct, right? We have been everywhere, and that is incredible, and the same-sex loving people or queer people or gender variant people or gender divergent people have always been with us. But it's really important to understand it in the context. Right. So part of what I do in both books, I think, right, was just saying, you know, you have these incredible romantic friendships between these women in the 19th century, which, you know, everybody knew about. And historians would say, well, they were just best friends, right? But they, you know, and I'd say, well, maybe, except that, you know, Annie Fields did sleep in the same bed with Sarah Orne Jewett for 30 years. So I wasn't there. I don't know what they did or didn't do.
Yeah.
But it's obviously more than than like gal pals. You know, or you know, but did George Washington and Lafayette, who had this intense relationship, most books say that, you know, George Washington saw him as his son, except those letters are not really like a son writing to his father. Right. So I think understanding the context of how they define their identities and their relationships is really important. Right. I think we can say that James Baldwin or Bayard Rustin saw themselves as 1950s homosexuals. But you really can't say that about Michelangelo, Da Vinci, or, you know, people. I read an article the other day that argued that Joan of Arc was a trans man. I thought, well, it's a good argument, but, you know, it doesn't make sense in terms of using language that didn't exist at the time. Right. So I think being careful about language. So one thing in the book, right, with Public Universal Friend, who was born Jemima Wilkinson, becomes Public Universal Friend, right, didn't use pronouns. So my editor and I decided, well, we can't use he or she, obviously. And another editor said, what about they? And I said, well, friend didn't use they. Friend didn't use pronouns. So I was then struck with how to write sentences saying friend 4 times. Friend preached, friend would do this, you know. I mean, you know, it was simply a sort of a grammatical exercise. But it's important, right, not to actually mischaracterize it. Not to say that Albert Cashiers was a trans man, which in modern terms, Albert Cashiers probably was. But that's not how Albert Cashier understood himself, I think. And that's actually a good exercise for, you know, even for like younger students, I would think, to actually think about what do we have in our lives now that may have existed 200 years ago that was thought of differently.
Mhm.
I mean, personally, I think that Joan of Arc was probably a religious fanatic who had psychotic episodes.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
would.
Or I would argue was actually a saint and really saw Saint Michael and Saint Margaret, if you're a Catholic.
Do any of you guys have any more questions in terms of what to ask?
So what is your project exactly?
Our project it's our senior capstone.
Mhm.
And we are examining representation of the LGBTQIA plus community in curriculum, specifically with a lens on social studies.
Yeah. So it's all going to culminate. Well, we're presenting all of our information on a Weebly website that we're going to be publishing to our teachers and our classmates, and then we present it in December. But we're also doing sort of a community outreach aspect as well, to bring this issue to the Miami University community, and how important it is to have LGBTQIA plus representation in our schools. You know, Miami University, I don't know how familiar you are with our campus or anything, but I'm sure you're not very, living in New
Not
Jersey. We live in a very rural, conservative township. So there's their campus community, and then the greater outside community, I would say, is very homogenous in the sense that it's very white, conservative, sort of, you know, lacks LGBTQIA plus. So we want to sort of bring in the local community as well into our project, and sort of provide an example. So
Right, and you would do that through social media, or
yeah, so we've already done well, we're working on our social media. So we've been sending out surveys to local community members, students, teachers, administrators, examining their perspectives on how they feel the LGBTQIA plus. It is sometimes a mouthful saying that all. Is represented in their curriculums, and we've got some great feedback thus far.
Yeah, I'm consider myself very lucky coming out of the 50s that I'm just a homosexual. I never say all the other letters, even though I use gay and queer all the time. But yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think we're very lucky to have a very supportive professor, and she's really looking forward to viewing our project, and we're very, very lucky to be able to present to our classmates and our peers. You know, because you talked about it. This is information it's very important, but it's also, we haven't shined a light on it until very, very recently. So we really want to learn and take what we have learned from you and this project in general, and use it in our own teaching pedagogies in the future. So
yeah, and I think the important, when you're dealing with students from, you know, 4th to 9th grade, it's really important to make history matter to people on an emotional level. That way they can understand it, right? I mean, just like that woman in my class saying that she totally understands student Marquis de Lafayette because she had been dumped on her last tweet or something. She didn't say that, but obviously it was clear that's what she was talking about. Right. It was also in class when there was this very nice student who was straight, who took the class because his girlfriend was in the class. He was an athlete. Yeah. And he raised a hand, and I said, "Oh my God, what's he going to say?" Right? And in the class, maybe 40 people, and he said, you know, I had a best friend in high school, and we were at different colleges, and we didn't keep up. And I feel this letter is really, it's my fault. I didn't write him, and I should have. And he totally got it. and he wasn't like coming out or anything. It was really like quite emotional for him.
Mhm.
But I think if you get the students on that level, whether they're in fifth grade or seventh grade, right, that you can really make them understand the sort of the importance of the emotion within the history,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and it's going to be meaningful to them.
Yeah, we really our cohort and our cohort professors, because we've all been taking the same classes for like 40 years now. They really make an emphasis on how to connecting with the students and building those relationships. And that's really the way, you know, we can talk all we want about our content and how well we know content. If you're not connecting with your students,
Yeah,
then you've already lost them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wrote I'm teaching a class now called Power to the People, which is Black Power, Radical Feminism, and Gay Liberation. And tomorrow is the fourth week in the Radical Feminism, where we cover Me Too movement, this sort of newest incarnation of radical feminism, right? And my last question is, you all have problems with the Me Too movement, like it's not organized, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't change the world, it just lets people speak out. How would you invent a Me Too movement on the Harvard campus that would avoid all the problems you have with the movement?
Wow.
As a way just to get them to think about what does it mean in their own lives and
Yeah.
to do something.
Yeah.
So we have 7 more minutes because alarmingly, I have a diversity and inclusion meeting at 5 on a Sunday night because nobody could make it tomorrow at noon. So they moved it to 5 tonight. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I always was going to say it's DIE, but it's DEI.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more like the movements it's more like the meetings are DIE. Uh,
Oh
yeah.
my gosh.
Even at Harvard, meetings are horrible. No, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Especially at Harvard, meetings are horrible. I mean, I'm glad to be here and everything, but it's like, whatever. So any more immediate questions? And I will remember I wrote a note to send you the James Baldwin quote, which I think is a really good quote, even, to use in the classroom too.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have any other immediate questions. We all really appreciate your time here.
Oh, sure. No. Well, my other option was actually reading and commenting on paper, so this is far more fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize how grateful we are to have you on. You know, when we first saw the email, we were all texting each other back and forth. We were like, "Oh my goodness, we can't believe you responded so quickly." I kidding you not, our
Yes,
professors.
I'm writing a book, and I'd rather do anything than finish the book.
No, our professors take a lot longer to respond to our request. So it was we are very grateful for the information you provided us and being able to get onto the Zoom tonight.
Sure,
Yeah.
and also send me the capstone when you finish with it.
Yes.
I
Of
will-
course,
I
of
will-
course.
Also, if you have any more follow-up questions that I really am like, except for my one day of teaching, I'm basically here doing other stuff.
Yes, awesome. We will send that to you, and if we have anything, we will reach out. Again, yeah, I know we said it like a billion times, but we're so thankful.
Sure,
that you would
I'm
do
happy
this for
to.
us.
I'm happy. My job at Harvard is I'm professor of the practice in activism and media. So, part of my job is to actually be out as an activist and a media analyst. So this is perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Sure. You may be interested. I'm writing a book on the queerness of children, the queerness of children's literature,
Wow.
based
Yeah.
on an article I wrote years ago that I'll send you a link to about Harry Potter being queer.
Oh my gosh,
Not
yes.
gay, but queer.
Yes, if you
right?
would.
The Harry Potter books.
Yeah.
I'm fully aware we don't like J.K. Rowling anymore, but that's I can't change the fact that she wrote the books.
Oh my gosh, yes. I will be purchasing that when it comes out.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I hope this is helpful. Any more follow-up questions, feel free to email me. And not tonight or tomorrow morning, I'll send you the James Baldwin quote and the Harry Potter piece.
Perfect. Thank you so
That's
much.
perfect.
Thank you so
Thank
much
Jen.
again.
Right. Good luck with
Yes.
everything.
Yes.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.